Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment. It does not depict real people events or official military actions. My name is Emily Kessler. I was 30 years old, a staff sergeant in the United States Army, when a routine medical check became the moment everything I had been taught to hide was quietly brought into the light. It was early October 2024 at Fort Cavazos Army Medical Center, one of those dry Texas mornings when the heat arrived before the sun felt fully awake. I remember adjusting my uniform in the parking lot, sleeves pulled down farther than necessary despite the warmth pressing against my skin. I told myself it was just habit, just discipline, just another appointment to get through before heading back to my unit. My stepdad, Mark Halverson, walked beside me close enough that his presence felt heavier than the gear I had carried overseas. He smiled at the front desk, confident, familiar, the kind of man who knew how to sound reasonable in any room. When the medic called my name, he stood up with me, answering questions before I could open my mouth, explaining things I had not asked him to explain, laughing lightly, as if this was all perfectly normal. Inside the examination room, the air felt sterile and quiet, broken only by the soft hum of equipment and the scratch of a pen against a clipboard. The captain assigned as the medical review officer greeted us with a nod, calm and unreadable. He asked routine questions: dates, deployments, sleep patterns. Before I could answer, my stepdad spoke. He always did. The captain did not interrupt. He simply listened, eyes moving between us, taking notes. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the reflex to stay composed, to stay quiet, to let things pass the way they always had. Then the captain closed his folder and looked directly at me. He asked one small procedural question, the kind meant to confirm privacy. When he requested to speak with me alone, my stepdad stiffened, his smile faltering for just a second before he protested softly, insisting he was only there to help. The captain repeated the request, steady and firm, not raised, not emotional. When the door finally closed behind my stepdad, the room changed. The silence deepened. The captain waited a beat, as if giving the air time to settle. He glanced at my uniform, at my posture, then at my arms folded carefully in front of me. His voice was even when he asked it, almost gentle. But the question landed with the force of something I had not prepared for. He asked about the marks under my sleeves. For a moment, I could not speak. My heart began to race, not with fear of punishment, but with the shock of being seen. No one had ever asked me that question in a place where the answer mattered. I felt the floor steady beneath my boots, and at the same time felt as if something inside me had cracked open. The captain did not accuse me. He did not rush. He simply waited, pen-still eyes attentive, as if the truth had time. In that pause, memories I had buried rose to the surface, not as chaos, but as clarity. I realized then that whatever I said next would not be swallowed by a family rule or dismissed as exaggeration. It would be documented. It would exist. And for the first time in years, I understood that silence was no longer my only option. If you have ever been in a room so quiet it felt louder than shouting, you will know exactly what that moment felt like. Comment: I know this feeling if you do. I grew up in Killeen, Texas, in a house that looked like stability from the outside. It sat on a quiet street not far from the base, with a trimmed lawn, a flag on the porch, and neighbors who waved politely and never asked questions. People assumed we were a good family. Church on Sundays, cookouts in the summer, school photos framed neatly along the hallway. My stepdad, Mark Halverson, liked that image more than anything. He worked hard to protect it, not by being kind, but by controlling how it was seen. When he married my mother, I was 9 years old. He already had a son from his previous marriage, 2 years younger than me, loud and confident, the kind of kid adults found charming. From the beginning, the rules were different for us. His son could talk back, and it was called personality. I stayed quiet, and it was called being respectful. His son broke things, and boys will be boys. I broke something once, and it became a lesson that lasted weeks. Mark never hit me in front of others. He was too careful for that. Control in our house came through tone, timing, and silence. He decided what I wore, how I spoke when I was allowed to leave my room. If I questioned him, he would smile thinly and remind me how much he had done for us, how lucky my mother and I were that he had stepped in. My mother learned quickly how to survive him. She survived by agreeing, by smoothing things over, by telling me to let it go. When Mark criticized me at dinner, she changed the subject. When he punished me for things his son did too, she said it was different. When I cried quietly at night, she told me he meant well and that family was about compromise. Over time, that message sank in. This was normal. This was what love looked like. You adapted, you endured, you stayed grateful. I watched my stepbrother grow up without consequences. He had friends over late while I washed dishes. He was praised for small achievements while my report cards were scanned for flaws. Mark spoke about him with pride about his potential, his future. When he spoke about me, it was in terms of what I owed, what I should improve, what I should stop doing. By the time I reached high school, I had learned how to disappear inside my own life. I stayed busy. Sports, part-time jobs, anything that kept me out of the house. Teachers called me disciplined, quiet, mature for my age. They did not know that discipline was survival. Silence was safety. The first time I saw a recruiter at school, I was 16. He spoke about structure-purpose standards that applied to everyone equally. That last part stayed with me. In the Army, rules were written down. Expectations were clear. Rank mattered more than favoritism. I knew it would be hard, but I also knew it would be honest in a way my home never was. When I told Mark I wanted to enlist, he laughed. He said I was too sensitive, too soft, that I would never last. When I told my mother, she worried, but she did not stop me. That was the closest thing to support she ever gave me. Leaving Killeen for basic training was the first time I slept without listening for footsteps in the hallway. The Army did not fix everything, but it gave me language for things I had never been allowed to name. Boundaries, authority, responsibility. Over time, I earned my rank. I learned how to lead soldiers younger than me, how to stay calm under pressure, how to document instead of react. From the outside, it looked like I had escaped. What people did not see was how deeply those early lessons stayed embedded. Even as a staff sergeant, even after deployments and evaluations, a part of me still reverted to that quiet child when Mark was nearby. Family pressure does not disappear just because you put on a uniform. It just learns new ways to follow you. Comment family pressure if you have ever lived inside something that looked perfect but felt wrong. By the time I made staff sergeant, people assumed the past no longer touched me. Rank does that to perception. E6 suggests authority confidence, a woman who can stand her ground. On paper, that was true. I ran teams, mentored younger soldiers, and passed inspections without breaking stride. I knew the regulations, the language of professionalism, the value of keeping records straight and emotions controlled. What those papers did not show was how control learned early does not vanish just because you grow older. It adapts. It waits for moments when you are tired, distracted, or invested in something you are afraid to lose. Mark understood that better than anyone. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to threaten. All he had to do was remind me subtly of consequences. He would mention my evaluations, my promotion board, the reputation I had built. He would say he worried about me, about how a misunderstanding could ruin everything I had worked for. He framed his interference as concern. He framed my silence as maturity. In the Army, there is an unspoken rule that problems should be handled quietly when possible. You document. You de-escalate. You do not make noise unless you have to. That culture exists for good reasons. Order matters. Trust matters. But it can also become a shield for those who know how to hide behind it. I told myself that what happened at home was not the Army's business. I told myself I could manage it, that it was not bad enough, that I had seen worse on deployment and survived. Each time I said that, the line moved. Bruises became marks I explained away as training injuries or clumsiness. Long sleeves became routine. Questions became something I learned to deflect with a smile. I was not lying outright. I was omitting. And omission felt safer. I had watched soldiers get sidelined for less. I had watched rumors grow legs and run faster than facts. I had worked too hard to let my name become a whisper attached to something I could not fully control. Mark counted on that fear. He would remind me of the sacrifices he claimed to have made, of the help he said he provided. He would say no one would believe me over him, not because he was stronger, but because he sounded reasonable. There is a particular kind of control that comes from sounding calm while making you doubt your own reality. Adults are especially vulnerable to it because we assume we should know better by now. I did know better professionally. Personally, the old wiring still fired. I was raised to believe that family problems stayed inside the house. That loyalty meant endurance, that exposing the truth was a betrayal worse than the harm itself. My mother reinforced that belief every time she asked me to keep the peace, every time she said it was complicated, every time she chose quiet over confrontation. So, I compartmentalized. I became excellent at it. Soldier Emily was efficient and respected. Daughter Emily was careful and compliant. I told myself these roles did not overlap. I told myself I was protecting my career, my unit, my future. In reality, I was protecting the status quo. Control thrives in systems that reward silence. I see that clearly now. Back then, I only felt the constant tension of maintaining two versions of myself. When the marks appeared, I handled them quietly. Ice, long sleeves, excuses rehearsed until they sounded natural. I did not think of myself as a victim. I thought of myself as responsible. Responsible for not causing trouble. Responsible for not disrupting my own progress. Responsible for managing a situation that should never have been mine to manage. The irony is that the very skills the Army taught me, discipline, restraint, respect for procedure, were the same skills that kept me silent. Mark did not need to trap me physically. He relied on my fear of consequences, my investment in my career, and my belief that enduring was the same as strength. That is how the bruises stayed hidden, not because I was weak, but because I was trained to handle things quietly. The captain did not react the way I expected. When I finally lowered my sleeves and answered his question, there was no sharp intake of breath, no visible judgment, no shift in tone that suggested accusation. He did not ask who did it. He did not ask why it happened. He did not ask questions that would force me to defend myself or relive details I was not ready to say out loud. Instead, he nodded once and wrote something down. The sound of the pen moving across paper felt louder than it should have. In that moment, I realized how deeply I had been conditioned to expect disbelief or escalation. His calm unsettled me more than anger ever could have. He explained his role slowly, clearly, as if he were speaking to someone who needed reassurance rather than interrogation. He said his responsibility was medical. He said his duty was to document observable facts and ensure my safety within the scope of care. He repeated that he was not there to discipline anyone. He was not there to make assumptions. He was there to follow protocol. That word landed differently than I expected. Protocol. It meant steps. It meant consistency. It meant this was not personal, and because of that, it mattered. As he continued to write, I felt my hands begin to tremble. I tried to steady them by pressing my palms against my thighs, willing my body to obey the same discipline it always had. It did not. My heart raced, not from fear of consequences, but from the shock of being taken seriously without being challenged. The captain asked a few clarifying questions, each one measured. Each one focused on timing and observation rather than blame. When did I first notice the marks? Had I experienced similar injuries before? Did I feel safe returning home after the appointment? Each question felt like a door opening to a reality I had avoided naming. I answered carefully, aware that each word would be recorded. The idea that my experience would exist on paper outside my head made my chest tighten. He explained that documentation was not a conclusion. It was a record, a snapshot of a moment in time. Facts without interpretation. He told me that records protect people not because they accuse, but because they create accountability. That sentence stayed with me. Accountability had always been something demanded of me, never something offered in my defense. I watched him note details with precision, the location of marks, their appearance, the absence of explanations that matched normal training injuries. He did not dramatize it. He did not soften it. He treated it with the same seriousness he would any medical anomaly. That neutrality gave the moment weight. As he wrote, the room felt smaller. Not claustrophobic, but focused. Every sound sharpened, the hum of the lights, the faint voices in the hallway, the ticking of a wall clock I had not noticed before. I became acutely aware of my own breathing, uneven and shallow. I had led soldiers through stressful situations. I had maintained composure under fire. Yet here, sitting on an examination table, I felt exposed in a way that stripped away rank and training. The captain paused and looked up at me again. He asked if I understood what documentation meant. I said yes, though I was not entirely sure I did. He clarified that documentation initiates processes, not outcomes, that it creates options, not obligations. He said I would not be forced into decisions I was not ready to make. The choice to speak further would remain mine. That assurance caused something inside me to loosen, and with it came a wave of emotion I had been holding back for years. My eyes burned, though I refused to let tears fall. Crying felt like a loss of control, and control was the one thing I had always protected. The captain noticed my reaction but did not comment on it. He handed me a tissue without breaking the rhythm of the appointment. That small gesture felt monumental. It was care without condition. He then explained the next steps in neutral terms. He said that based on protocol, certain observations required notification through proper channels. He did not name agencies or consequences. He simply stated that the system had mechanisms designed to respond when documentation met specific criteria. Hearing that made my stomach drop. Not because I feared punishment, but because I realized the silence I had maintained might no longer be enough to contain what was happening. The captain asked if I had any questions. I wanted to ask 100 things. What would happen to my career? Who would know? How far this would go? Instead, I asked the only question that felt safe. I asked if I had done something wrong. He looked at me steadily and said no. He said seeking medical care and answering honestly was not wrongdoing. It was responsibility. That word again, responsibility. Not endurance, not silence, responsibility. When the appointment ended, he stood and opened the door, signaling the transition back to the world outside the room. Before doing so, he asked one final question quietly, almost as an afterthought. He asked if anyone had ever asked me about those marks before. I shook my head. He nodded once more and said that sometimes the right question at the right time changes the trajectory of things in ways we cannot predict. As the door opened and the noise of the hallway returned, I realized my hands were still shaking. Something irreversible had begun, not with an accusation, but with a pen, a protocol, and a question that refused to be ignored. Do you believe one well-timed question can save a life? The captain did not call Mark back into the room right away. Instead, he stepped into the hallway and spoke to him quietly, his voice low and professional. I could not hear the words, but I could see the shift in body language. Mark leaned forward at first as if arguing his case, then straightened when the captain raised one hand slightly, not aggressive, just final. A moment later, the captain returned alone and closed the door behind him. He did not lock it. He did not rush. He simply stood there for a second, giving the room time to settle again. That was when I realized how hard it had been to breathe with Mark nearby. The absence of his presence felt like oxygen rushing into my lungs after years underwater. My shoulders dropped without me telling them to. My jaw unclenched. I did not even notice I had been holding my breath until I exhaled shakily and had to press my lips together to steady myself. The captain took his seat across from me and spoke calmly as if grounding both of us in the same reality. He said the words clearly, without emphasis, without drama. This is not disciplinary, this is medical. Something about hearing that distinction out loud broke through the fear I had carried into the room. Disciplinary meant consequences, investigations, damage to a career I had spent over a decade building. Medical meant care. It meant assessment. It meant that my well-being mattered independently of rank or reputation. The captain explained that asking Mark to step out was standard procedure when sensitive observations were involved. He said privacy was not a punishment, it was a safeguard. He repeated that I was not in trouble and that nothing about this process assumed guilt or wrongdoing on my part. As he spoke, I felt something unfamiliar, relief layered with disbelief. I had spent so long expecting confrontation that calm felt suspicious. I searched his face for signs of hidden judgment and found none. He was not taking sides. He was creating space. That space changed everything. Without Mark in the room, my thoughts slowed. I could hear myself think. I noticed details I had ignored earlier, the faint smell of disinfectant, the steady ticking of the clock, the way sunlight filtered through the narrow window. These small things anchored me in the present. I was not a child anymore. I was a staff sergeant sitting in a medical office speaking to an officer whose job was to ensure care. That reality felt fragile but real. The captain asked if I felt safe continuing the appointment without my stepdad present. I answered yes without hesitation, surprising myself with how quickly the word came. He nodded and noted my response. He did not congratulate me or frame it as courage. He treated it as a normal preference, something I was allowed to have. That alone felt revolutionary. As the minutes passed, my breathing steadied. My hands stopped shaking. The tension in my chest loosened enough that I could sit back against the examination table without flinching. I realized that Mark had always filled rooms even when he said nothing. His silence had weight. It dictated how much space I was allowed to occupy. With him gone, the room belonged to me. The captain reviewed what we had discussed so far, summarizing in neutral language. He did not ask me to justify myself or recount painful memories. He focused on the present moment and my immediate needs. He asked about sleep, appetite, stress levels. Questions any patient might be asked, but ones I had never answered honestly before. I found myself responding without rehearsing my words. The truth came easier when no one was standing between me and my own voice. At one point, I laughed softly at myself, startled by the sound. The captain glanced up, not confused, just attentive. I told him I had forgotten what it felt like to sit in a room without being managed. He acknowledged that statement with a simple nod. He did not probe further. He did not need to. The acknowledgement was enough. As the appointment continued, I became aware of a quiet shift inside me. Isolation, which I had always associated with punishment or abandonment, felt different here. It was protective. It was intentional. It gave me room to exist as myself rather than as an extension of someone else. The captain explained that maintaining that separation would continue for the remainder of the medical process that day. He said it matter-of-factly, as if stating a schedule change. I realized then that Mark would not be coming back into that room. Not because he was being excluded, but because his presence was no longer necessary. That distinction mattered more than I could articulate. When the appointment concluded, the captain stood and asked if I was ready to step out. I nodded, feeling steadier than I had when I walked in. As he opened the door, I caught a glimpse of Mark down the hall, speaking to someone else. His posture stiff, his face tight. For the first time, his reaction did not dictate mine. I walked out beside the captain, breathing freely, grounded in the knowledge that this moment was about my health, not my obedience. Isolation, I realized, was not loneliness. It was oxygen. The captain did not explain everything at once. He did not reach for a phone immediately or signal urgency with his movements. Instead, he completed the medical portion of the appointment with the same steady pace he had maintained from the start. He reviewed his notes, confirmed observations, and asked if there was anything else about my health I wanted to address before the visit concluded. That normalcy was intentional. It kept the moment from tipping into panic. When he finally mentioned the next step, he framed it as a continuation of procedure rather than an escalation. He said that certain documented findings required notification through established channels. He emphasized that this was not a decision made in the room, but a standard response triggered by criteria that existed long before I sat on that examination table. He explained that the Army did not rely on individual judgment in situations like this. It relied on systems designed to reduce bias and protect everyone involved. Hearing that was unsettling and reassuring at the same time. I had lived under someone else's judgment for most of my life. The idea that this was now moving into a process that did not depend on how persuasive someone sounded felt unfamiliar but stabilizing. The captain asked if I had questions. I asked what notification meant in practical terms. He said it meant that a report would be forwarded, reviewed, and handled by professionals trained to assess situations without assumptions. He did not name names yet. He did not dramatize outcomes. He was careful to stay within the boundaries of his role. When he stepped out briefly to initiate the notification, he told me exactly what he was doing and why. Transparency mattered. I waited alone again, but this time the waiting felt different. It was not the anxious waiting of a child listening for footsteps. It was structured, bounded. I knew what was happening, even if I did not know where it would lead. Through the closed door, I could hear muffled conversation phones ringing the ordinary sounds of a busy medical facility. No alarms. No raised voices. Just the machinery of a system turning quietly. When the captain returned, his demeanor had not changed. He told me that the appropriate office had been notified and that personnel would arrive to handle the matter in accordance with protocol. He said it plainly without emphasis. I noticed that he did not say when. That uncertainty made my stomach tighten, but it also underscored the reality of how this worked. There were no dramatic entrances, no immediate confrontations. Things moved on schedules and availability. That slowness felt deliberate. It gave everyone time to adjust to what was unfolding. As we waited, the captain explained my options in careful language. He said I could remain in the medical area or step into a quieter space. He said I could request a support person of my choosing if I wished. He did not suggest who that should be. He left the choice with me. That autonomy was new. I chose to stay where I was anchored by the familiarity of the room. Minutes passed, then more minutes. I checked the clock on the wall and noted the time, another habit from years of training. Nothing about the delay felt neglectful. It felt procedural. Outside, I caught glimpses of Mark moving down the hallway, his earlier confidence replaced by visible tension. He glanced toward the examination rooms more than once, clearly trying to read the situation. For the first time, I was not responsible for managing his perception. The captain did not engage with him. He did not explain or reassure. That was not his role. The separation held. Eventually, two individuals arrived dressed plainly, their demeanor professional and restrained. They did not announce themselves loudly. They spoke briefly with the captain, exchanging information in low voices. I recognized the insignia and understood what it meant before anyone said the name. Criminal Investigation Division, CID. The words carried weight, but not in the way I had imagined. There was no accusation attached to their presence, no assumption of guilt. They were there because a process had reached the point where their involvement was required. One of them acknowledged me with a respectful nod, not a stare. They did not ask me questions in that moment. They did not pressure me to speak. Their focus was coordination, not confrontation. I watched as they turned their attention down the hallway toward Mark. The interaction that followed was quiet, controlled, almost mundane. No one raised their voice. No one drew attention. Mark stiffened as they spoke to him, his face flushing, his posture defensive. They did not touch him. They did not accuse him. They simply asked him to come with them so they could speak privately. That distinction mattered. Everything about the exchange reinforced the same truth. This was not about spectacle. It was about process. Standing there, I felt the full weight of what was happening not as chaos but as inevitability. The captain remained beside me, not intervening, not narrating. He had done his part. He had documented, notified, and stepped back. Watching the system move at its measured pace, I understood something fundamental. Justice in this context did not arrive with force. It arrived with patience. It moved slowly, deliberately, and without asking for my permission to exist. For the first time, the outcome was no longer dependent on my ability to endure quietly. It was being handled. They did not make an announcement when they approached him. There was no calling out of his name across the hallway, no sharp commands, no visible urgency meant to draw attention. That was the first thing that struck me. In movies and television, authority arrives loudly. In real life, especially inside military spaces, it often arrives quietly. The two CID agents positioned themselves just close enough that Mark could not ignore them. One spoke while the other listened. I could not hear the words, but I did not need to. I recognized the posture shift immediately. His shoulders tightened. His chin lifted slightly, the reflex of a man used to being in control. He glanced around as if searching for someone to intervene, to smooth things over, to reassert the version of events he preferred. No one stepped forward. The waiting room continued its low hum. Conversations paused briefly and then resumed in softer tones. A few heads turned not out of curiosity but instinct. People sense when something serious is happening even when it is handled gently. Mark nodded once sharply as if arguing internally with a conclusion he had not chosen. The agents did not touch him. They did not crowd him. They simply indicated a direction and waited. That waiting did more than any physical force could have. After a moment that felt much longer than it was, Mark gathered his jacket and stood. The movement was stiff, rehearsed the way people stand when they want to appear composed while everything inside them is unraveling. He did not look at me. That was not kindness. It was calculation. He still believed silence could protect him. As they began to walk, the agents positioned themselves slightly behind and to either side, not blocking him, just guiding. Escorted, not arrested. That distinction mattered. It preserved dignity while simultaneously removing control. The hallway seemed longer as they moved down it. Every step echoed louder than the last, not because of sound, but because of meaning. This was a man who had spent years shaping narratives, controlling rooms, deciding when conversations began and ended. Now he was following someone else's lead, not because he had been overpowered, but because protocol required it. That was the humiliation. Not exposure through shouting or accusation, but exposure through procedure. People noticed. They always do. A nurse paused mid-stride. A soldier looked up from his phone and then quickly looked away. Someone else shifted seats, suddenly interested in the floor. No one asked questions. No one whispered loudly. The absence of reaction was its own verdict. In that silence, Mark lost the thing he valued most, the appearance of normalcy. He was no longer the confident man accompanying a family member to an appointment. He was someone being escorted by CID in a public space. That image would linger far longer than any explanation he could offer later. I watched the entire process from where I stood, the captain beside me, but not touching me, not directing my attention. He did not narrate what was happening. He did not frame it as justice or consequence. He allowed the moment to stand on its own. My body reacted before my mind did. My pulse slowed. My breathing deepened. The tightness I had carried for years loosened incrementally, not all at once, but enough that I noticed it. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel relief the way I had imagined it might come. What I felt was a strange, grounding clarity. This was real. It was happening, and it was happening without me having to say a word. As Mark reached the end of the hallway, one of the agents opened the door for him. He hesitated just for a second and then stepped through. The door closed behind them with a soft, unremarkable sound. No slam, no finality that begged for attention. Just closure. That was when it hit me. The humiliation was complete, not because everyone saw him leave, but because no one needed an explanation. The visual was enough. The system had spoken quietly, and in doing so, it had stripped away the story he had relied on for years. The captain waited until the door was fully closed before turning to me. He asked if I was all right, the same way he would ask any patient who had just witnessed something stressful. I nodded, unsure how to articulate what I was feeling. He did not press. He did not offer commentary on what had just occurred. That restraint reinforced everything I had seen. This was not about spectacle. It was about boundaries, about removing someone from a space they no longer had a right to occupy. As we walked back toward the examination room, I realized something else. The people who had looked away, who had chosen discretion over curiosity, were part of the process too. They understood, perhaps intuitively, that this kind of moment did not require an audience. Public humiliation in its most effective form does not need noise. It needs witnesses who understand what protocol means. By the time I sat down again, Mark was gone from the building entirely. Not erased, not forgotten, just removed. For the first time, his absence did not feel temporary. It felt procedural, and that made all the difference. The waiting room did not erupt after the door closed. There was no gasp, no collective murmur, no one rushing to fill the silence with speculation. That was what made it powerful. Life resumed in fragments. A phone buzzed. A chair scraped lightly against the floor. Someone cleared their throat. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath, everything had. People had seen enough to understand that something serious had occurred, and they understood just as clearly that this was not a story meant to be told out loud. Military spaces teach you that quickly. You learn when to look and when to look away. You learn that discretion is not avoidance, but respect for process. Still, awareness moved through the room like a current. I could feel it without turning my head. The knowledge that Mark had been escorted out by CID did not need words to spread. It settled into posture, into the way conversations softened, into the way people gave me space without acknowledging why. When I stood to return to the examination room, a woman I had not noticed before met my eyes briefly and then nodded once, a small gesture of recognition that said more than sympathy ever could. It was not pity. It was acknowledgement. The waiting room had become a witness without becoming a crowd. By the time I left the medical center later that morning, the atmosphere had shifted further. Outside, the Texas heat pressed down, familiar and relentless. Soldiers moved between buildings, focused and purposeful. On a base, news travels fast even when it travels quietly. It moves through glances, through pauses in conversation, through the absence of someone who was expected to be present. Mark's absence was already being noted. People who had seen him arrive with me would remember seeing him leave differently. They would replay the moment in their minds not with embellishment, but with curiosity. What had prompted CID to appear? Why had it happened here? Why now? Rumors do not need facts to form. They need a vacuum, and the system creates that vacuum intentionally. It does not rush to explain. It lets the image stand. That is how social authority shifts. Mark had always relied on his ability to control perception. He knew how to charm neighbors, how to speak confidently, how to frame himself as reasonable. That power depended on access. Access to rooms. Access to conversations. Access to me. The escort removed that access in a way no argument ever could. It did not label him. It did not accuse him publicly. It simply changed how others saw him. From someone accompanying a soldier to someone being guided out by investigators. The difference was subtle but irreversible. Over the next few days, I felt the ripple effects. People I had known casually began to treat me with a different kind of care. Not exaggerated concern, but awareness. A clerk took extra time to explain paperwork. A senior NCO checked in with a simple question about how I was holding up without prying. No one mentioned Mark by name. No one needed to. His influence had been present through proximity. Without him nearby, the space around me felt safer, wider. Social power shifted not because I demanded it, but because the system had intervened in a visible way. Even outside the base, the change was noticeable. In Killeen, where everyone knows someone connected to the military word, spreads through informal networks quickly. Someone had seen something. Someone else had heard about CID at the medical center. The details varied, but the core remained intact. Mark was no longer the unquestioned authority in our family narrative. He was a question mark. That alone altered the balance. My mother called me that evening. Her voice was tight controlled. She did not ask what had happened. She asked if I was all right. It was the first time she had ever asked that without immediately minimizing the answer. I told her I was. She was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence I heard the weight of years of avoidance pressing in. She did not defend him. She did not explain him. She said she needed time. That was new. Silence, when chosen rather than imposed, has a different texture. As days passed, I noticed something else. The way people spoke to me had changed. Not because they knew details, but because they sensed a boundary had been enforced. Boundaries command respect in military culture. They signal that someone is protected by more than personal resolve. They signal institutional backing. I had not asked for that backing. I had not demanded belief. It had been granted through process. The waiting room had seen everything without hearing anything, and that was enough. No one needed my version of events to understand that something serious had occurred. The system had spoken in the only language that matters in environments built on order, removal, procedure. Quiet authority. Social power does not always collapse dramatically. Sometimes it simply drains away, leaving behind a hollow space where confidence used to sit. Mark's power had depended on being present on shaping moments in real time. Without that presence, his influence diminished rapidly. I did not celebrate that shift. I observed it. Observation had become my new posture. Where I once scanned rooms for threat, I now scanned them for balance. The waiting room had been the first place I understood that I was no longer alone in this. Not because people had taken my side, but because the truth no longer needed my voice to exist. What followed did not feel dramatic. There were no sudden meetings called in my name, no officers pulling me aside in hallways, no questions fired at me without warning. Instead, the system moved the way it was designed, to move steadily and quietly, like gears turning out of sight. The captain completed his report the same day, his notes clinical and precise. Dates, observations, statements recorded without interpretation. I did not see the document, but I knew it existed, and that knowledge alone shifted something inside me. For years, my experience had lived only in memory and silence. Now it lived on paper anchored by timestamps and signatures. That made it harder to erase. Medical notes were entered into the system according to regulation, accessible only to those with a legitimate need to know. There was no language of accusation, only documentation of condition and context. The neutrality of it mattered. It meant I did not have to convince anyone of anything. I did not have to rehearse my story or anticipate disbelief. The facts stood on their own. Within days, command notification followed not as a spectacle, but as a procedural update. My chain of command was informed in the same restrained manner as any other issue affecting a soldier's welfare. There was no announcement, no gathering, just a quiet acknowledgement that something required attention. My commanding officer called me in, closed the door, and spoke plainly. He did not ask for details. He did not press for explanations. He said he had been notified of a medical matter and wanted to ensure I had the support I needed. That was it. No suspicion, no skepticism, just responsibility handled at the appropriate level. I realized then how much I had feared the idea of command knowing, not because they would punish me, but because I had been trained by my family to expect blame. That expectation did not materialize. Instead, I was offered options: time, resources, the ability to proceed at my own pace. The system did not demand a performance from me. It demanded compliance from itself. I did not have to say anything negative about Mark. I did not have to frame him as anything at all. The process did not require character assessments or emotional testimony. It required documentation, coordination, and boundaries. That absence of narrative felt strange at first. I had grown up believing that truth only mattered if it was defended loudly. Here, truth mattered because it was recorded correctly. Each step reinforced the same message. I was not responsible for managing perceptions. I was responsible only for my own health and duty. Others would handle what fell outside my role. As the days passed, I noticed how carefully information was compartmentalized. People who needed to know were informed. Those who did not were not. Rumors existed at the edges, as they always do, but they had nothing solid to attach to. There were no quotes to twist, no emotional outbursts to misrepresent. Silence supported by procedure became a shield rather than a liability. I continued my duties with minimal disruption. There were check-ins scheduled and respectful. There was paperwork clearly explained. There was no expectation that I justify myself. That alone felt like a reversal of everything I had been taught at home. In my family, silence had always benefited the person with power. In the Army, silence paired with documentation benefited the person being protected. That distinction changed how I understood strength. Strength was not endurance at all costs. It was alignment with systems that functioned whether or not anyone liked the outcome. At one point, a junior soldier asked me casually if everything was okay. The question was genuine, not probing. I answered honestly but briefly. I said I was handling a medical issue and appreciated the concern. That was enough. I did not owe anyone details. I did not need to defend my boundaries. The system backed them by default. The longer this went on, the clearer it became that I had been carrying unnecessary weight for years. I had believed that keeping the peace required my participation. In reality, peace was maintained through process. I had believed that protecting my career meant hiding parts of my life. In reality, my career was protected because the system recognized when a soldier needed support. I had believed that speaking ill of family was a betrayal. In reality, I had not spoken ill at all. I had spoken factually when asked and allowed documentation to do the rest. Watching the system move quietly, I understood something fundamental. Justice in environments like this does not announce itself. It does not require villains or speeches. It exists in the careful accumulation of records, the respectful transfer of information, and the consistent application of protocol. I did not need to say anything about Mark for his influence to diminish. I did not need to explain myself for my position to be secure. The system was doing what I had always done for others. It was handling the situation without noise, without bias, and without asking me to carry it alone. The moment of public exposure did not arrive with a summons or a dramatic announcement. It came as a scheduled board review, placed on a calendar like dozens of others ordinary in appearance and precise in structure. Unit-level disclosures are designed that way for a reason. They are not trials, they are not stages. They are procedural checkpoints where information that affects readiness and welfare is acknowledged by those responsible for oversight. When I walked into the room that morning, I recognized the faces around the table. Officers and senior NCOs who understood exactly what their roles were and just as clearly what they were not. No one looked at me with curiosity. No one looked at me with suspicion. They looked at their folders. The chair opened the session by stating the purpose in plain language. This was a review of documented facts relevant to a recent medical report and associated notifications. That was it. No names emphasized. No narratives framed. The facts were read aloud as they existed on paper. Dates, locations, observations, actions taken according to protocol. Each item was presented without commentary. There were no adjectives, no conclusions drawn beyond what the documentation supported. I listened as my own experience was translated into formal language. It felt strange hearing it stripped of emotion, but that stripping was what gave it power. This was not my story anymore, it was a record. The effect on the room was immediate and restrained. Heads nodded where understanding was required. Notes were taken where follow-up was needed. There were no interruptions, no questions meant to probe beyond scope. The system was not interested in drama. It was interested in clarity. When the discussion moved to implications, it did so carefully. The chair outlined what the documentation meant in terms of boundaries and access. Certain individuals were no longer permitted to be present in specific contexts. Certain interactions were restricted pending further review. These were not punishments announced aloud. They were administrative realities acknowledged by those responsible for enforcing them. Mark was not in the room. He did not need to be. His absence was part of the record. Outside that room, the impact spread quickly. In military communities, authority is tied to trust and proximity. When access is limited, perception changes. Word traveled through the unit and beyond it, not through gossip, but through observation. People noticed who was no longer present at family events on base. They noticed who no longer accompanied me to appointments or gatherings. They noticed the quiet adjustments that signaled a shift in standing. Mark's reputation had been built on appearing involved and respected. Without access, that image began to collapse under its own weight. In Killeen, the change was even more pronounced. Community respect there depends heavily on perceived alignment with the military. Being seen as close to it confers status. Being quietly distanced from it removes that status just as effectively. Friends stopped calling him for advice. Invitations slowed. Conversations ended sooner than they used to. No one needed an explanation. The association had changed. I did not announce anything. I did not correct rumors or fuel them. I did not defend myself or accuse him. I continued my routine. Work, training, home. The system did the rest. That was the most striking part of it all. Exposure did not come from me speaking out. It came from facts being acknowledged by authority. People trust procedure more than personal accounts, especially when they are accustomed to hierarchies. When the board review concluded, the chair thanked everyone and closed the session. There was no lingering discussion, no emotional release. The room emptied in an orderly fashion. As I walked out, one of the senior NCOs paused beside me and said quietly that the process had been handled correctly. It was not praise. It was confirmation. That mattered more than any validation I could have imagined. The aftermath unfolded over days and weeks. I watched from a distance as Mark attempted to maintain normalcy. He explained less because there was less to explain. Questions went unanswered because answers were no longer expected. The social authority he once wielded had depended on unquestioned access and confidence. Both had been eroded by documented fact. The humiliation was complete, not because he was shamed publicly, but because the community recalibrated around new information without needing instruction. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no spectacle, just a shift. That is how power changes hands in disciplined environments. It does not topple loudly. It drains quietly until there is nothing left to hold on to. Standing in the aftermath of that shift, I felt something close to peace. Not victory, not revenge in the way stories often frame it. Justice that does not need noise. If you believe justice does not need shouting, please tap like. He reached out 2 weeks after the board review. Not with anger, not with threats, but with a tone I had never heard from him before. Careful. Measured. Almost tentative. The message arrived on a Tuesday evening just after I returned from duty when the day had settled enough that silence filled the spaces between thoughts. He asked if we could talk. He said there had been misunderstandings. He said he wanted to explain. That word stood out immediately. Explain. For years, explanations had only flowed one direction. Now he was asking for the chance to offer one. I did not respond right away. I let the message sit. That alone was a reversal of power. When I finally agreed to meet, it was on my terms. A public place. Midday. Neutral ground. I chose a quiet cafe near the edge of town, far from the base, far from places where familiarity could be leveraged. When he arrived, he looked smaller. Not physically, but socially. His confidence had softened around the edges. He smiled when he saw me, but it did not reach his eyes. We sat across from each other, a small table between us, the hum of other conversations providing cover. He started with an apology that was not quite an apology. He said things had gone too far. He said he never intended for things to escalate. He said he had been trying to protect the family. I listened without interrupting. I did not correct him. I did not react. That unnerved him more than anger would have. He shifted in his chair, took a breath, and tried again. He said the situation had damaged his reputation. He said people were treating him differently. He said he did not understand how a private matter had become so public. Then he asked for my help. That was the audacity. He wanted me to clarify things, to speak to someone, to smooth things over. He said it would help everyone move on. The words sounded reasonable if you did not know the history. That was his skill, framing self-interest as concern. I waited until he finished. I took a sip of coffee. I looked at him steadily and said no. I did not raise my voice. I did not justify my decision. I simply said no. The reaction was immediate. His composure cracked. He asked why. He said family should handle things internally. He said I owed him a chance to explain himself. That word again. Explain. I told him there was nothing for me to explain. I told him the process had already handled what it needed to handle. I reminded him that I had not accused him publicly, had not spoken his name in any official setting. The facts existed without my commentary. That was not something I could undo. He leaned forward, then his voice dropping. He said he needed this. He said the situation was affecting his standing in the community. He said he could lose everything he had built. I recognized the tactic instantly. Shifting responsibility, making his consequences my burden. For years that had worked. This time it did not. I told him his standing was not my responsibility. I told him my role was to take care of myself and my duty. I told him I would not interfere with a process designed to operate without personal influence. He stared at me, disbelief flickering across his face. He said I was being cold. I considered that for a moment, then I agreed with him. I said I was being clear. Clarity often feels cold to people accustomed to control. The conversation ended shortly after that. He stood, abruptly muttered something about regret, and walked away without looking back. I remained seated until he left the cafe. I felt no rush of triumph, no surge of vindication. What I felt was steadiness. a sense that something had aligned correctly for the first time in my life. In the days that followed, he tried again. A voicemail, an email. Each message carried the same theme: explanation, help, repair. I did not respond. Silence was no longer something imposed on me. It was something I chose. The consequences unfolded without my involvement. Invitations he once received stopped arriving. Calls went unanswered. People who had once sought his opinion kept their distance. The system did not reverse course. It did not soften because he asked nicely. That was the lesson he could not accept. Power granted by process cannot be negotiated emotionally. I heard through others that he was angry that he blamed me for what he had lost. That did not surprise me. Accountability often feels like betrayal to those who have never faced it. I did not correct those narratives either. I had learned something essential. Refusing to participate in someone else's damage control is not cruelty. It is self-respect. When I thought back to that meeting later, what stayed with me was not his anger, but his shock. The shock of encountering a boundary he could not cross. The shock of realizing that the person he once controlled was no longer available to manage his consequences. That was the true reversal. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, the way reality often does when it is no longer being managed by someone determined to control it. Mark lost access first, not symbolically, but practically. He was no longer permitted to accompany me to appointments or events connected to the base. His name stopped appearing on visitor lists. His presence was quietly removed from spaces where it had once been assumed. That kind of restriction does not make noise, but it is unmistakable to the person experiencing it. Access is currency in military communities, and once it is revoked, it rarely returns without effort and time. He tried to test those boundaries more than once. A request here, an assumption there. Each time the answer was the same. Not from me, but from the system. No. No explanation required. No appeal offered. I did not have to enforce the boundary. I simply lived within it. That distinction mattered. It meant I was not acting against him. I was acting for myself. My mother struggled more visibly. Without Mark's constant presence shaping every interaction, she was forced to sit with the silence she had helped maintain for years. At first, she avoided the subject entirely. Our conversations were cautious, limited to logistics and neutral updates. She asked about work, about the weather, about anything except the thing that now existed between us. Eventually, that avoidance cracked. She told me she felt lost. She said she did not know how things had reached this point. She said she wished she had handled things differently. I listened. I did not argue. I did not reassure her that everything was fine. I did not offer comfort that would erase responsibility. Silence, when chosen deliberately, has weight. I let her feel it. She asked if I was angry with her. The question hung between us, fragile and overdue. I told her I was not angry. I told her I was clear. That distinction surprised her. She had lived in a world where emotional reactions were expected and managed. Clarity did not fit into that framework. I explained that her silence had protected Mark, not me. That choosing peace over truth had consequences even if they were unintended. I did not say this to punish her. I said it because it was true. She cried quietly, not dramatically, not defensively. Just tears that came from understanding something too late to change. That was her consequence, not abandonment, not rejection, just awareness. I did not comfort her the way I once would have. I did not rush to ease her discomfort. Growth does not happen when discomfort is immediately smoothed over. I maintained our relationship, but on new terms. Honesty replaced appeasement. Boundaries replaced obligation. The shift was uncomfortable for both of us, but it was real. Mark, on the other hand, responded with resentment. He framed his losses as my choices. He told anyone who would listen that I had overreacted, that the system had been unfair, that families should resolve issues privately. Those words fell flatter than they once would have. People heard them through a different lens now. Without access, without authority, his explanations lacked traction. He was no longer someone whose version of events carried weight. That is the quiet consequence of exposure through process. It removes credibility without announcing its removal. I did not correct his statements. I did not defend myself publicly. I did not need to. The absence of my participation denied him the conflict he wanted. Revenge requires engagement. Consequences do not. Over time, the narrative shifted without my involvement. People stopped asking questions. Interest waned. Life moved on. That movement was its own verdict. I focused on my work on rebuilding routines that had once been shaped around managing someone else's reactions. I noticed how much energy I had freed simply by not anticipating Mark's moods. Sleep came easier. Decisions felt lighter. Even simple things, choosing where to go, who to see, no longer required calculation. That was not revenge. It was relief. When I reflected on what had happened, I understood something essential. Revenge seeks satisfaction through another person's suffering. Consequences emerge from reality asserting itself. I had not set out to punish Mark. I had set out to survive. The system responded to documented facts. Boundaries were enforced. Access was revoked. Social standing adjusted. None of that required anger or intent. It required alignment. My mother began to adjust as well. She started making choices without deferring automatically. She asked questions she had once avoided. Our relationship changed slowly, unevenly, but honestly. That honesty was uncomfortable, but it was also freeing. For the first time, our conversations did not revolve around preserving an image. They revolved around understanding what had been lost and what could still be built. I did not celebrate Mark's isolation. I acknowledged it. I did not take pleasure in my mother's regret. I recognized it. Those responses did not make me cold. They made me grounded. Consequences are not revenge. They are what happens when truth is allowed to exist without interference. I had spent years believing that endurance was the same as strength. I learned instead that strength is letting reality take its course. I did not need to destroy anyone's life. I only needed to stop sacrificing mine to protect theirs. Rebuilding did not begin with a dramatic decision. It began with paperwork, a quiet conversation with my commanding officer, a choice presented without pressure. I was offered a transfer to a different assignment within the same installation, one that would reduce unnecessary overlap with my past and give me space to recalibrate. The option was framed as routine career management, not rescue. That mattered. I accepted without hesitation. The move was practical and symbolic at the same time. New office, new daily rhythm, new faces who knew me only as Staff Sergeant Kessler, not as someone's daughter or someone's problem to manage. On my first morning in the new role, I arrived early out of habit. The building smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning solution familiar and grounding. I sat at my desk and realized I was not scanning the environment for tension. I was simply present. That absence of vigilance felt unfamiliar, but welcome. Alongside the transfer came something I had avoided for years. Therapy. Not as a mandate, not as a corrective measure, but as a resource offered plainly and professionally. I scheduled the appointment with the same mindset I brought to any other responsibility. It was something to be handled. The first session surprised me. There were no probing questions designed to break me open. There was no expectation that I perform insight or emotion. The therapist spoke in terms of patterns, coping mechanisms, and long-term stress responses. She treated my history not as a confession, but as data. That approach resonated deeply. I had lived most of my life managing risk. Therapy became a place where I could examine those strategies without judgment. I learned how control learned early can masquerade as competence later, how silence can be mistaken for strength, how boundaries feel uncomfortable when you have never been allowed to have them. Progress was not linear. Some days I left feeling lighter. Other days I felt exhausted as if I had carried weight without realizing it. I kept going anyway. Discipline, it turns out, can be repurposed. My support system grew quietly, not dramatically, not all at once. A fellow NCO who checked in without prying. A mentor who shared his own experience navigating personal challenges while maintaining professionalism. A friend who did not need explanations, only presence. These connections formed naturally once I stopped hiding. I did not overshare. I did not make my story my identity. I allowed myself to be known in pieces on my terms. That was new. Outside of work, I made small changes that added up. I moved into a different apartment. I rearranged my schedule. I said no more often than I used to, and yes, only when it felt honest. I noticed how much energy I had spent anticipating other people's reactions. Without that burden, I had room to think about what I wanted next. Career goals, personal goals. Not escape plans, but aspirations. The difference was subtle but profound. I was no longer running from something. I was moving toward myself. There were moments when guilt surfaced. Old reflexes do not disappear quietly. I would catch myself wondering if I was being selfish, if I owed more, if rebuilding meant abandoning someone else's needs. Each time I returned to the same truth. I was not rebuilding against anyone. I was rebuilding for myself. Permission was never required. One afternoon, while reviewing files at my desk, I realized I had gone several hours without thinking about Mark at all. The realization startled me, not because I missed him, but because of what it represented. He no longer occupied space in my mind. That space had been reclaimed by ordinary concerns, deadlines, training schedules, weekend plans, normal life. That is how healing often shows up, not as a breakthrough, but as absence. My relationship with my mother continued to evolve, slowly, carefully. We spoke more honestly than before, though not always comfortably. She began to make choices without immediately deferring. I learned to let her sit with her own emotions rather than rushing to fix them. We were learning new roles without a script. Some conversations ended awkwardly, others ended with a quiet understanding. That was enough. Rebuilding did not erase the past. It contextualized it. It placed it where it belonged, behind me. The uniform I wore every day no longer felt like armor. It felt like a tool, a reminder of what I had earned and what I was capable of. I stood taller without effort. I spoke more directly. I trusted myself in ways I never had before. None of this required confrontation or declaration. It required consistency. Over time, consistency becomes identity. I thought often about the idea of permission. How many years I had waited for it. Permission to speak. Permission to rest. Permission to choose differently. The truth is, permission was never something anyone else could give me. It was something I had to claim by living as if my needs mattered. At 30, starting over did not mean starting from nothing. It meant starting from experience, from clarity, from boundaries hard won. If you have ever found yourself rebuilding in your 30s or later quietly and without applause, you are not behind. You are still standing. Comment "still standing" if that resonates with you. It took me time to understand that silence itself was never neutral. For most of my life, I believed staying quiet was a form of maturity. It kept the peace. It avoided escalation. It protected relationships that felt too fragile to survive truth. Many of us were taught that lesson early, especially those raised to value order, loyalty, and appearances. Silence was framed as strength, as discretion, as something admirable. What I did not understand until much later was how easily silence can be repurposed by someone who benefits from it. Silence does not just prevent conflict. It prevents accountability. And when accountability is absent, patterns harden. Mark did not need my silence to act. He needed it to continue acting without consequence. Each time I chose not to speak, not to correct, not to push back, I reinforced a system where his behavior existed without friction. That is not an accusation against my younger self. It is an observation. At the time, silence felt like the safest option available. It was adaptive. It worked until it did not. The ethical problem with silence is not that it hides truth. It is that it teaches the wrong person that nothing will change. Over time, that lesson becomes permission. I know many people my age and older who recognize this pattern instantly. We grew up in families where problems were handled privately, where image mattered, where endurance was praised and confrontation discouraged. We were told not to air dirty laundry. We were told to be grateful. We were told that speaking up would only make things worse. In many cases, those lessons were meant to protect us. In practice, they often protected the person with power instead. Silence helped Mark because it allowed him to believe he was untouchable. It allowed him to control narratives without challenge. It allowed others to look away comfortably knowing no one was forcing the issue. My mother's silence played a role too, not out of malice, but out of fear and habit. Silence becomes generational when it is rewarded. It becomes normal when it is never questioned. That is how harm persists quietly without villains announcing themselves. When the system intervened, it did not do so because I spoke out dramatically. It intervened because silence finally met documentation. That distinction matters. I did not break silence by shouting. I broke it by answering a question honestly when it was asked in the right context. The ethical shift happened not because I exposed anyone publicly, but because I allowed truth to exist within a structure designed to handle it. That is an important difference, especially for those of us who value order and fairness. Silence helps the abuser when it isolates the truth. It helps when it convinces the person being harmed that endurance is the same as virtue. It helps when it teaches families that discomfort is more dangerous than injustice. Breaking silence does not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like allowing the right people to see what has been hidden. For a long time, I thought speaking up meant choosing chaos. I thought it meant destroying relationships, careers, stability. What I learned instead is that silence was already doing that work just slowly and unevenly. It was eroding trust, distorting reality, and placing the burden of adaptation on the wrong shoulders. The moment silence stopped serving its protective role, it became complicity not in intention, but in effect. That realization was uncomfortable. It forced me to reevaluate how many times I had mistaken patience for wisdom and restraint for righteousness. This is not about assigning blame to those who stayed quiet. Many of us did so because we were taught that was the responsible choice. This is about recognizing when that choice stops being ethical. For people in their 50s and beyond, this reflection often lands differently. We have lived long enough to see patterns repeat. We have watched silence preserve appearances while problems fester underneath. We have seen how families fracture not because someone spoke up, but because no one did. The question is not whether silence ever has value. It does. The question is who benefits from it and at what cost. In my case, silence helped Mark maintain control. It helped my mother avoid confrontation. It helped the family look functional. It did not help me. When silence ended, not through accusation but through process, the balance shifted. Accountability entered the picture quietly. Boundaries became enforceable. The ethical weight moved from the person enduring harm to the systems designed to prevent it. That is how it should have been all along. Understanding this did not turn me into someone who speaks loudly or often. It made me more intentional about when silence is appropriate and when it is harmful. There is a difference between discretion and erasure. One protects dignity, the other protects dysfunction. Learning to tell them apart was one of the most important lessons of my adult life. Silence helped the abuser because it removed resistance. It helped the system fail quietly. Truth once documented did not need my voice anymore. It carried itself. That is not a call to action or a lesson to impose on anyone else. It is simply an observation earned through experience. Silence is powerful. Used wisely, it preserves peace. Used reflexively, it preserves harm. Knowing the difference is not about courage. It is about clarity. Quiet victory does not look like a celebration. It does not arrive with applause or a sense of final conquest. It settles in slowly, almost unnoticed, until one day you realize your life feels lighter than it used to. That is how it came to me. Not as a moment, but as a pattern. Mornings where I woke without tension already coiled in my chest. Evenings where I made plans without calculating who might disapprove. Days where my thoughts stayed in the present instead of looping through old conversations and imagined outcomes. Peace did not announce itself. It simply took up residence. I continued my work at Fort Cavazos with the same professionalism I always had, but something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer bracing myself against an invisible force. I was no longer managing someone else's emotions as part of my daily routine. That absence changed everything. My performance did not suffer. If anything, it improved. Clarity has a way of sharpening focus. I noticed how much of my energy had been spent anticipating conflict that never needed to be mine. Without that drain, I had room to lead more effectively, to mentor with patience, to make decisions without second-guessing myself. I did not need validation for this change. I could feel it in my body, in the way my shoulders stayed relaxed even during long days, in the way my voice remained steady because it no longer needed to defend itself. I did not forgive Mark, not because I was holding on to anger, but because forgiveness was not required for my peace. Forgiveness for me would have implied a reconciliation that was neither possible nor healthy. I did not owe him that. I owed myself honesty. I owed myself safety. I owed myself a life not built around managing someone else's control. Letting go did not require absolution. It required boundaries. That distinction mattered. I also did not seek revenge. I did not wish him harm. I did not celebrate his losses. What happened to him unfolded as a consequence of documented reality meeting systems designed to respond to it. My peace did not come from his discomfort. It came from my freedom. Those are very different things. Over time, even the impulse to check for updates about him faded. Curiosity dissolved into indifference. That was the clearest sign of healing. When someone no longer occupies mental space, their power is gone. My relationship with my mother found a new equilibrium. We did not return to what we were before, and I did not want to. We built something quieter and more honest. Some conversations were still difficult. Some topics remained tender. But there was no longer a third presence shaping our interactions. We spoke as two adults, imperfect and learning. That was enough. I learned that peace does not require everyone to understand your choices. It only requires you to live them consistently. The world adjusted accordingly. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped rehearsing answers for questions that were never asked. I trusted the alignment I had found. When people asked how I was doing, I answered simply. I said I was well, and I was. The uniform I wore every day no longer felt like something I hid behind. It felt like an extension of who I was. Not armor, not identity, just part of a whole. I had not changed who I was at my core. I had changed what I tolerated. That made all the difference. Quiet victory is waking up without fear of being interrupted. It is making decisions without waiting for approval that never comes. It is understanding that you can be compassionate without being compliant. It is knowing that your worth is not measured by how much you endure in silence. I once believed strength meant absorbing discomfort for the sake of others. I know now that strength can also mean stepping aside and letting systems do their work. It can mean refusing to participate in cycles that harm you. It can mean choosing peace even when forgiveness and reconciliation are not on the table. There is a certain calm that comes from alignment, from living in a way that no longer contradicts your own values. That calm does not need to be defended. It speaks for itself in how you move through the world. This story does not end with punishment or redemption. It ends with balance, with a life reclaimed quietly and fully. That is the victory that lasts. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that peace does not have to be loud to be real, please share it with someone who might need to hear it.